Good day there, and welcome back to you. I hope you had a good holiday season. It's not quite the 1st of January 2024, but the new year is right upon us as of this recording. So I have a question for you. Can you still use a broken typewriter? Or another way of asking the question is, how usable is a manual typewriter that is not perfect? Which begs the other question, is it possible to have a typewriter that's perfect, mechanically perfect? And how usable is it when it's not perfect? Those are some interesting questions that might have a lot to do with how usable you find your typewriter to be for the job of actually writing with it. Stay tuned. Well, given that nothing mechanical is actually ever perfect, the real question should be, how usable is it depends upon what's actually working with the machine. So I've kind of thought about this, and I've divided it into two categories. We'll call them deal killers and minor issues. Deal killers are things that are wrong with your typewriter that will prevent you from really being able to write with it at all. At least it'll be such a distraction that you can't really put up with it much. So here is a list of some deal killers that I have noted in my experience. Escapement issues, where the characters either pile up or you have a lot of skips. Now, this is a gray area because sometimes typewriters will just occasionally skip or pile letters, and whether or not that's a deal killer depends upon your tolerance for those issues and how frequently it's doing it. But if it's doing it quite often, that's a deal killer. It's really difficult to do any creative writing with a skipping escapement. And related to the escapement or the moving of the carriages, maybe the carriage is really hung up, or maybe there's a point in the carriage where the movement of it just stops. Something's binding. You really can't use it very well under those circumstances. And also, of course, if your spring motor is broken or the drawband is broken, that's a deal killer pretty well also. Here's one that maybe you've experienced. Some of the letter keys or the type bars for the letters or the space bar are broken. So in other words, you don't have all 26 letters and a space bar. It's hard to write when you're missing letters of the alphabet. So I think those are deal killers. You have to have at least all of the letters and the space bar to be functioning in order to print with it properly. The line spacing has to be somewhat regular in order for you to have readable, legible type on a piece of paper. And especially if you want to convert that text later on to a digital file with an OCR, optical character recognition software, it has to be regular enough for the software to recognize it as printed type. I think a ribbon advancing problems and the ribbon doesn't move, I think that's a deal killer because pretty soon the imprint will get really faint and you'll probably punch a hole through the ribbon. Now, that's not the same thing as the ribbon not reversing or intermittently not reversing. That, I think, can be lived with, depending on your tolerance level for it. But the ribbon not advancing at all, that's a deal killer. How about paper feed is totally wonky. The paper just slips, goes sideways, goes crooked really bad. I think that's a deal killer. It's really difficult to get legible type under those circumstances. I think the left margin has to function. If it doesn't, it's a deal killer. When you do a carriage return, you want it to stop reliably on the left margin. You want a left margin mechanism that's there, first of all, and that works. The right margin, not necessarily, but certainly the left one. And then another thing that I think is a deal killer is the on feet in motion, or that is the alignment between the upper and the lowercase characters. I think you can live with minor misalignment, but severe misalignments, or where some of the characters are badly shaded or very faintly printing, that's a deal killer. That needs to be resolved, especially if you're writing with the machine and you're going to be converting that printed sheet into a digital file with optical character recognition. It needs to be good enough for that. Okay, so those were deal killers. I have a list now of what I call minor issues that don't stop a machine from being useful, at least for first drafts. So, a broken carriage return lever. And yes, I have one right over here on my bookshelf. My Olivetti Studio 44 is a wonderful typewriter. I think it's one of the best machines Olivetti ever made, but mine has a broken carriage return lever. Does that stop me from using it? No. What do I do instead of using the carriage return lever? Well, I pull the carriage back with the right knob and then twist it however many clicks I need to go. 2 clicks for single spacing, 3 clicks for 1.5 line spacing. You could also push it from the left knob and twist it that way. Either way, I think a broken CR lever is a minor issue because if you've ever tried writing with a Corona 3 or a, let's say, Remington Portable, they essentially don't have carriage return levers anyways. You're pretty much doing what I have to do with the Studio 44 on those machines regularly. And Corona sold millions of Corona 3s. Another issue that is an inconvenience, but just minor, I think, is if you have one broken or missing knob. If you have both knobs broken or missing, that's probably a deal killer because it's hard to move the carriage manually. But one broken knob, not so much. An example, one of my 4 Hermes 3000s is missing the left platen knob, but it's still a usable machine. Ribbon reverse flaky. If you have an intermittent ribbon not reversing, you'll probably notice it when the type starts to get faint, but you can manually reverse it. So it's a nuisance, but as long as the ribbon is moving when it's between the ends, then it's only a nuisance and not a deal breaker, at least for me. Paper feed, slightly crooked. We talked about when the paper feed is really wonky, but my Remington Portable had really old feed rollers, and I recovered them in heat shrink tubing, which improved it, but didn't make the paper feed perfectly straight. So is that a deal killer? Well, I might be less inclined to use the machine than otherwise, but it can still put out a whole page of text. Just the lines are slightly pinched into the left and wider on the right side. So it's a nuisance, but not a deal killer. If some of the number keys are broken or the type bars for those numbers don't work, I think you can use the machine as long as you have all the letters, a period, a comma, and the apostrophe. I think those 3 punctuation marks, plus all the letters and the space bar, I think it's functional. If you have the number 2 key or the number 9 key or 4 or whatever isn't working, not so much of a deal breaker, I think. I think you can work around that. How about the right margin is not working, or maybe you don't even have a functional right margin system at all? That's not a deal breaker for me because I usually set my right margin off to the edge of the paper. I don't want to be bothered with the line lock interrupting my word right in the middle of my word. And then sometimes when you hit the margin release, sometimes it may not print the next character exactly evenly, depending on how your line lock works. So if the line lock is a problem or the right margin is a problem, just set your right margin way off to the edge of the paper and don't worry about the right margin. At least that's my feelings. Generally, as you're writing, you can see when you're getting close to the edge of the paper. If you're a touch typist, or at least you are enough of a touch typist to be looking at the paper frequently enough, you can see, oh yeah, the right margin is getting close. I can see the previous lines of text, and I'm getting toward the end of those. You should be able to tell when it's time to do a carriage return. How about tabs not working? Well, there's a lot of machines that were made without tabs. Tabs are not necessary if you are rough draft typing or creative writing. More so, perhaps, if you are trying to format your paragraphs properly, but you can still get around not having tabs. So they're not really necessary, I think. Minor on-feed and motion issues. Minor misalignment between the upper and the lower case is a nuisance, but it's not a deal killer. But it's something you want to adjust and get fixed, certainly. How about the shift lock being broken? I have a machine that I cannot rely on the shift lock. If I lock it, start typing, it'll invariably pop loose. So until I fix that, the obvious fix is just push down one of the shift keys and type one-handed if I have to do a number of letters. And the other issue is bichrome. The bichrome may be wonky, or you might have a portable, ultra-portable machine without a bichrome entirely. As long as the full height of the character prints and you can use a single color ribbon, then bichrome should not be a showstopper for you. Well, I've talked about usable versus unusable typewriters based on the kind of problems they are, but it also depends on your usage mode. In other words, how close to perfection does your usage of typewriters depend? Some of the purposes of typing that you might want close to perfection on a machine is maybe you're going to be publishing these typewritten pages. What I mean by publishing, it could be something as mediocre as just putting them out on the internet on a blog or whatever for other people to see. Maybe you're self-conscious about that. I know I was certainly a lot more than I am now. I want it to look perfect. Or you like writing letters to other people and you want your letters to look very fancy and neat and perfectly printed. So that might limit you to a certain kind of machine that produces perfect looking type, even though actually it's not perfect, most likely. Also, if you're doing some kind of typing that's going to be for the public, some kind of public writing, maybe poetry, perhaps you might want close to perfection. But on the other hand, especially for poetry, maybe a typewriter that puts out a slightly more, let's say, creative style of type might work well with your poetic style, right? Something like an old machine that looks very beautiful, puts out imperfect type, imperfectly aligned text, could work really well for a poem, but not necessarily for a document written to your community, government, or whatever. So some typewriter imperfections can be invisible to the reader of the typewritten piece, but they become very obvious to the writer himself in the process of trying to create the typewritten document. Part of this, how close to perfection is the typewriter, has to do with how fiddly is the typewriter and what is your tolerance, your personal tolerance for fiddliness. For instance, I mentioned earlier the Corona 3 is a little bit more fiddly of a typewriter by its nature, and some people can enjoy using it, other people wouldn't. It's a matter of personal preference. So again, I mentioned earlier my Olivetti Studio 44 with the broken carriage return lever. To me, it's not too fiddly to make a makeshift carriage return action simply by pulling the carriage to the right, twisting the knob however many clicks, or if you like with your left hand, push it with the left knob and turn it. To me, that's not too fiddly. But some so-called minor issues that don't seem to be big when you do it once in a while can become nagging issues over time that can be a major distraction to your creative process. So, for instance, a flaky ribbon reverse may not be a showstopper for you unless it's starting to really interfere with your creative process. It keeps you from entering into or staying in the flow state of creativity. Or an intermittent skipping or piling on of letters. If it only does it once in a while, maybe you don't mind, but if it starts happening over a period of time too much, and if you had a choice, you might start using a different typewriter because that would be a little bit too irritating. Or if the paper feed is too crooked. Even my Remington Portable with the heat shrink recovered feed rollers is a little too irritating for me to use all the time for letter writing or journal typing because it's just enough of an irritation. Or anything else like misaligned type. What's your tolerance for the letters not being perfectly straight or off to one side or the other? Is it really an issue? Will it become an issue over time? Or maybe you have a typewriter that tends to clog up the letters. They get dirty and messy pretty easily, and maybe that's a ribbon issue. Perhaps you can fix that with a lighter ribbon like a nylon ribbon or whatever. For non-public use of typewriters, like for writing your own private stuff, first draft stuff, The performance bar for how well the typewriter has to work can be set lower, I think, as long as it doesn't go into the area of personal irritations, right? So, for instance, you only need to have a good enough typewriter to get a legible type printed on paper. And it only has to be good enough so that you can do optical character recognition if you want to convert it directly to a digital text file, or good enough so that you can revise it. If your writing process involves a first draft and then a series of revisions, that first draft only needs to be good enough so you can read it and type a revision. Few enough distractions that it permits you to enter the creative flow state. That's the real bar of whether the typewriter is usable. Here's a final question maybe you should ask yourself about whether this typewriter is usable. Should I get it fixed, or should I learn to fix it or live with it? Okay, here's the question. How best should you expend your creative energy? And you have really two choices in this matter in regards to typewriter problems. A, you can fix a problem child typewriter, try to get it close to perfection, but keeping in mind perfection mechanically is often unattainable in real life. Or B, you can spend that same amount of creative energy actually working on your next writing project. And that choice is up to you, and it depends upon your tolerance for imperfection. But in the real world, the real nitty-gritty world, most mechanical objects are imperfect. And this is why back in their heyday, there were a lot of typewriter repair shops. Not so much today. That's why we have to learn to keep our fleet of typewriters working for us. But I hope these thoughts have you thinking about how best can I use my typewriter or typewriters for creative purposes? How can I get by with not having to be obsessed about perfection mechanically, but good enough for the purposes of writing with it? I wish you well in your creative ventures, and as always, stay creative and have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye for now.